Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security for Kubernetes enables organizations to securely build, deploy, and run cloud-native applications anywhere. Today, we'll walk through the major features of ACS and demonstrate vulnerability management, network segmentation, custom policies, and more. Let's begin our user interface overview by quickly touring the left-hand menu, where you can gain access on views into network segmentation, policy violations, compliance with benchmarks, supply chain vulnerabilities, configuration management policies, risk profiling, and platform configuration. But let's go back to the main ACS dashboard. The dashboard serves as the security overview, helping the security team understand what the sources of risk are, categories of violations, and gaps in compliance. Each of these tiles represents violations of policies which have been broken down into customizable categories, and each is clickable for more information. ACS is currently securing 2 clusters. We can limit our view down to a single cluster and details specific to that cluster alone. You can see this cluster has 526 system violations, 12 of which are considered critical. If we go back to our production cluster, we can focus our view and see the critical vulnerabilities and notice the most risky deployments on that cluster specifically. Let's look at the vulnerability management dashboard. This dashboard provides a view of where vulnerabilities are, which are the most widespread or the most recent, and where the container images are coming from. This tile of top risky deployments shows us which applications contain the most risk. Let's take a quick peek at this most risky deployment, Asset Cache. From here, we can quickly see the security context of this deployment. We can see the policies violated, the CVEs and their ratings, and the images ranked by their risk. But let's go back to the dashboard before diving any deeper. Along the top, we can filter our infrastructure and focus on a particular cluster, production being our most risky. We can see a tile that shows us our most risky namespaces within that cluster. Let's take a peek at front-end namespace. You can see the list of riskiest images. And again, this most risky deployment, here's our Asset Cache application. Let's broaden our view again. Even more important than fixing each individual vulnerability image by image is establishing a process to keep container images up to date and preventing the promotion of images that have serious fixable vulnerabilities. ACS provides a rocksctl command line tool which can be leveraged in CI/CD pipelines for exactly that goal. Let's take a look at some of our top riskiest images. When we click into this MasterCard processor image, right away we can see that upstream is no longer providing new CVEs. This is a big red flag for the security of our image. In the corner here, we can see the most risky components within the image. OpenJDK and struts with 38 CVEs. We can view the list of 329 CVEs in the entire image and notice that many of them are fixable. We can also dive into the Docker file used to create the image and expand the individual commands, giving us a view into the components which were added by the command and the CVEs that component contributed. All of the vulnerabilities identified by the ACS scanner exist because they were in the base image or were added by other layers in the Docker file. This CVE, for example, is scored at 9.8, which is very high, but it is fixable. If we look, Debian has provided a fix for this quite some time ago. We just haven't applied it to the image. Looking at this CVE for curl, we can see it's used in 4 deployments. with Visa processor being ranked as the top risk priority and MasterCard processor ranked as an 8. Let's look at the risk component and understand how this is calculated. ACS is Kubernetes-native and goes beyond simple image scanning solutions to understand how deployment, configuration, and runtime activity affect the likelihood of an exploit occurring and how successful an exploit may be. Resources are limited, so it doesn't make sense to tackle vulnerabilities which have a low likelihood of exploitation and minimal impact until the more likely and potentially damaging vulnerabilities are tackled first. ACS prioritizes risk, allowing for more effective mitigation. For example, this use of port 22 seems very unusual, and we can see our service account has cluster admin privileges. If this deployment is compromised, it could do a lot of damage. ACS presents the context of the deployment. We can see the container ports, additional details, including the fact that this pod is privileged. It's the Process Discovery tab that gives the greatest visibility into the runtime activities. By monitoring containers to see what processes are typical, ACS can create a baseline of activity. Processes that are unusual stand out. For example, running this command to install a package. Why would we be installing netcat on this container? Violations of predefined policies are also detected at runtime. Processes outside the baseline are presented in red, enabling you to add them to the baseline if they look legitimate. I don't think this one's legitimate. If we briefly compare this to the MasterCard processor deployment, there are fewer risk indicators. While not unimportant, it's clear we should focus on the Visa processor first. Network Graph illustrates observed data flows and enables review and generation of firewall rules using Kubernetes-native network policy resources. After focusing on the production cluster, the graph represents actual traffic observed in the past hour. By selecting the payments namespace, we can see 3 deployments and their active flows. We're able to inspect the 2 flows for the Visa processor deployment and compare them to any network policies. There don't appear to be any defined. Best practice would dictate that only the necessary flows be explicitly allowed. If we filter our view down to the payments namespace, we can use the network policy simulator to generate network policy resources. Because ACS is leveraging Kubernetes-native features, security teams can communicate with developers using the language they're already familiar with. We can then share these network policies with the payments developer for incorporation into their deployment pipeline. Violations record all the specific times where a policy criteria has been met by any of the objects in your cluster, images and their components, deployments, or runtime activity. Think of it as a stream of events that have occurred, but not necessarily a to-do list for incident response. After filtering on the production cluster, let's narrow down to the observed violations of a single policy. This policy looks for the intersection of deployments with CVEs having a common vulnerability score of 6 or greater and having a privileged container. Once again, our infamous Visa processor deployment bubbles to the top. We can see the list of fixable CVEs at the bottom. And details in the policy tell us the rationale and the remediation. Notice that this policy takes effect in the deploy lifecycle stage. Let's look at another policy that takes effect during the runtime of an application. This policy looks for execution of the apt-get command, and here we can see the installation of netcat that occurred at runtime. The container ID, the timestamp, and the user ID are all logged for forensics. If this policy were enforcing, the container would have been killed. Instead, we're giving a notification and the commands necessary to place in our Docker file for removing the package manager. ACS ships with a number of policies like this designed to prevent hackers from gaining a foothold or moving laterally through your infrastructure. ACS provides policies with targeted remediation for build, deploy, and runtime lifecycles. Let's examine the system policies and understand how they're defined and how we can customize them. I'll search for policies that check for the presence of package managers in an image for Ubuntu, Alpine, and Red Hat Linux distributions. Since containers are immutable, it's unlikely we need to install any software at runtime. So as a best practice, we should remove any package managers. This policy will check for the existence of the apt or depackage commands and alert us if they're present. When we edit this policy, we can see it's associated with a category of security best practices. Let's add another category and see how that populates the dashboard. When making changes, it's possible to add other criteria to the policy. We can match on different image content attributes or even instructions in the Docker file. After saving our changes, a dry run will occur, showing us detected violations of our policy. Enforcement can be enabled separately at the build and deploy lifecycle stages. If enforcement is turned on, the rockctl utility can be used in your pipeline to fail builds or fail deployments when violation is detected. Now that we've made this change, let's go back to the dashboard. Now you can see where these tiles come from. The package management category of policies is represented by this tile. And we can see here that the Ubuntu package manager and image policy now shows up in the list. And finally, let's look at the compliance dashboard. You can see that ACS ships with several industry standards out of the box, including CIS benchmarks for Docker and Kubernetes, HIPAA, NIST, and PCI. These standards are applied to each of the clusters being secured by ACS, and we can see a report by cluster how well each standard ranks. Let's see how our production cluster is doing with PCI. Policy 114 requires a firewall in the DMZ. This doesn't exactly make sense in Kubernetes, but we can interpret that to mean firewalling as a network policy. And we're only 9% compliant across the cluster. How about we narrow that down to our payments namespace? How are we doing there? 100%. You may recall we created a network policy earlier, so our developers must have taken advantage of that and applied it. We can take another view to see how a cluster or a namespace ranks across each standard. We can narrow this down to our production cluster and limit again to our payments namespace, then see how it ranks across each one of the standards. Okay, we are good on Docker, but we still have ways to go on PCI. You can see we get specific information at the namespace level for each standard and control, enabling you to have greater visibility into the overall security stance of your environment. Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security for Kubernetes enables you to build, deploy, and run cloud-native applications with confidence, increasing protection by eliminating blind spots and providing insight into critical threats, reducing the time and effort needed to implement security by streamlining analysis, investigation, and remediation using the rich context that Kubernetes provides. Be sure to tune in next week to learn how ACS shifts security left by integrating with continuous integration and deployment pipelines. For now, enjoy these kittens.